number of issues. One of the most important issues I want to talk about is dealing with a Supreme Court decision that I know is going to be impacting many of us, and especially in the businesses, in terms of churches. Now, we have with us here on the show my guest host, Michael Peffer.
Hi, Brad.
Now, Michael,
great to be here.
You head up the office for the Pacific Justice Institute in the Orange County office, or Southern California office.
Yes.
It's located at Trinity Law School in Santa Ana.
Yes.
You've been here with us for a number of years. I really appreciate the fine work that you do and the interns that you have and the coursework that you do teach. Actually, you do some on-site professor work there as well, working with the students. And I know we've addressed a lot of issues with the Pacific Justice. We have 47 cases right now in active litigation.
That's right.
Just right now alone, 47. Yeah. And some of those are your cases.
That's right.
So I appreciate you spending the time to be with me on this program today. One of the most, challenging cases I think that I've seen come down to the Supreme Court, I think the most surprising, because I didn't think it would turn out this way, was the Supreme Court's recent decision addressing the topic of how is sex defined by the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yes.
So before we get into the details of that, I want us to talk about an understanding of how our government works.
Right.
Because then I think they'll appreciate why this is such a serious case. So give us a heads up in your context as a professor. We'll do that.
That's right.
You just first as a professor. But about the balances, the checks and balances that we're supposed to have in our country when it comes to the issues that we're facing. And while there is also some overlap, there's also some separate and distinct roles of these branches of government.
That's right.
And this is going to play into this case that we're going to talk about, which, by the way, folks, you're going to find that this is going to probably be impacting not only your business, your church, your community. It's a serious blow toward our civil liberties, and I think we need to appreciate that for what it is. So, Michael, give us some heads up about the big picture. Let's start with the big picture.
And I think that's really important, Brad. We are a system, we have a government that's set up to avoid tyranny. Right? We have this separation of powers, they call it, and so I know many people know about this, but it's important in the context of this case and others like it to realize that we have three branches of government. We have the executive branch, we have the legislative branch, and we have the judicial branch. All three of those have separate functions. All three of those, maybe there is overlap, but there is separate functions that they're supposed to operate in. And what's most important for the purposes of this case and many cases that come before the United States Supreme Court is that the legislative branch is responsible for making the rules, for making the laws. And the judicial branch is responsible to interpret those laws and tell what they mean and what is not constitutional. So when that operates well, it's a great system, right? I mean, we see a lot done and things are great with this, but when it fails, it really makes our system less stable, I believe. And so, for instance, in this case, we have a clear piece of legislation that was done in 1964, and it has operated in its own way since 1964.
More than 50 years.
That's right.
More than 50 years. It's the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Yes.
It's not some strange little piece of legislation in some cubbyhole.
That's right.
We've all seen it.
Yes.
It's been used in court in cases countless times.
That's right.
And yet the Supreme Court decided to reinterpret it, if you will, in a way that not only violates the original intent, but also how it's been applied and understood to be applied for decades.
Yes.
And this is what we were hoping that we wouldn't see again with the new Trump appointments.
That's right.
And we're going to talk about that as to why it is and try to figure that out. I mean, many Americans are trying to figure that out. But as far as what the decision said, now let's get into that. The civil rights laws used the word sex to protect women, including the Civil Rights Act of
Absolutely.
1964 and moving into 1971. I mean, that was the context of the word sex.
That's right.
It was specifically to protect women.
Right.
And yet, that is not the way this Supreme Court has now redefined the term sex as it was written more than 5 decades ago.
Yeah. What's interesting about this, Brad, is that, so again, back to our legislative function, Congress has been grappling with whether they ought to change the definition of sex and or add additional protected categories, right? Because they could easily do that. Right. Congress can easily change its own legislation to say, hey, this not only covers sex, but it also covers sexual orientation and gender identity. Those words can be written right into that law.
They could do that.
Exactly. In fact, many states have.
Now, let me ask you this. At any time, while Congress was debating, we should change this, you have some on the left saying, yeah, we should change it. We should, make these changes because we want to change society in this regard. Right. Given, okay, and that's their right to advocate that. But no one, as I understand it, said in all of Congress, from the left to the right, no one said, oh, no, we don't need to change it because sex already means, gender identity. It already means sexual orientation. We don't need to change it. It already clearly means that. Not a single member of Congress from the left or the right has even pretended that to exist.
Yes. And they've been arguing about this for 45 years. So in that 45 years, no one's saying, hey, we don't need to change this. In fact, the left was saying, we really need to change this. And,
right.
and there's been a piece of legislation designed to do that for 45 years, 45 times, basically. And so they were saying, hey, we need more protection. We need to have more people protected. And those ought to include sexual orientation and then of recent gender identity.
Right.
So it was already, if you will, at least implicitly, sex didn't mean orientation or identity.
Right. Well, Michael Peffer, I really appreciate you making these comments. And, as we look forward, Michael Peffer, on the changes that we're dealing with, I think people need to understand the history about it, that this was not something that anyone of any credibility, I believe, honestly believed was understood by the original intent, the matter of original intent to be in the legislation for sex to be redefined this way. And yet it was, and that's extremely challenging and disappointing.
And one of the critical things about this, Brad, is that who isn't for protecting women in the workplace? Everybody is for protecting women in the workplace. And so it seems to me that for this Supreme Court now, that protecting women in the workplace wasn't enough. We have to dilute that protection by saying, well, it really means anything you want it to mean. Right. And that may sound like a sarcasm, but it really isn't. And the important thing for our audience is to realize that if we continue to move outside these guidelines, these roles of the three branches, then it makes our system very unstable.
Yeah, very, very unstable moving forward. And, basically, these justices have engaged in a classic judicial activism. I mean, that's what it is. When they decide to change what something means from its original intent, they say, oh, no, we know what's best. We know what society needs for today. We are going to be the new dictators, oligarchy.
Yeah.
And that's what they did. What really bothers me, though, even more about this, I mean, if we had a court with, liberal judges dominating, which we've had through, most of my lifetime.
Yeah.
I could sort of see that. That's the kind of character of the judges that we're dealing with. That judicial activism, power's gone to their heads. and now they're abusing that power, breaching that trust. We've seen that, and,
That's right.
and we've despised it.
Yes.
And many people went to the polls in the last presidential election, and they voted specifically on this issue. It was the number one issue among evangelicals, is the breach of trust by judicial activist judges and
Yes.
justices from the Supreme Court all the way down. They turned out in large numbers, and they wanted the right judges appointed. The candidates on the face of it, Neil Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, on the face of it were excellent candidates.
Yes.
And then Roberts was understood to be somewhat level-headed, and yet we had two justices, Roberts, the Chief Justice, and Neil Gorsuch, going to the radical judicial activism side on this.
Yeah.
Any idea what caused them to do this?
Yeah, I think it's important enough to underscore the dissent, and as our audience may know, each decision has a majority opinion. Then there's oftentimes concurring opinions. That is, I agree with you, but I want to add this. And then there's dissenting opinions where the members of the court say, no, I don't agree with this, and it should have ruled this way. Well, in this dissent, Justice Alito said there's only one word for this, what has happened here, and that is legislation. And that is something that Justice Gorsuch promised that when being going before the Senate, that he would not engage in his judicial activism.
Yeah.
But here, the two of them, and Roberts has done this a number of times now, the two of them joined together with the liberal side of the court and ruled in a way that changes this law, which is legislation.
Yeah.
Now, I honestly, I don't really understand Justice Roberts, because Roberts came in as at least a nominal conservative voice, ruled for a long time in pretty much a conservative voice, and until it got time to talk about Obamacare. And if you'll remember, in the Obamacare, Justice Roberts said that this allowed that to continue.
Right. And I was outraged by that as well.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, because he actually said, well, he's like deferring to the Senate, to Congress. Well, if he actually deferred, then he would treat it as on the issue of is it a tax or not a tax.
Yes.
But he, in his decision, decided to say, yeah, I'm going to defer, but by the way, I'm going to call it something else
Yes.
in order to get over this hurdle,
Right.
so we can approve it.
Yeah.
And that was just, I say a breach of trust is a nice way of saying it. We'll just say breach of trust.
I agree.
Definitely a breach of trust.
Yeah.
And yet, we see something even more diabolical and even a greater breach of trust when it comes to a blatant change in a word that has real clear original intent backing it up, clear record, deep record backing it up. What does sex mean? What's the purpose of it? It's to protect women. And then we see them deciding to reapply it to terms. I mean, who knows? They may decide to reapply it to polygamists. They may reapply it to bestiality, try sexual relationships, trifolds. I mean, there's all kinds of applications with their kind of rationale that they've utilized that could apply to this down the road to justifying all kinds of things that might be less debatable if it was passed by the legislature.
Right.
And that's just where we are as a nation and where the people are as a nation. Right. But instead, it's something that they are taking away from the legislative branch of government. And that's why I'm so glad you talked about that initially at the top of the show. They took and invaded the legislative branch of government, breached the trust of we the people who elected those representatives, and decided that they know what's best, that they have their new society, their new vision of this new world, and they know what's best. Yes. And that is frightening. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and it's one of the flaws in our Supreme Court right now, is that I sincerely doubt that we have the checks and balances moving forward. Right now, we just have to count on the fact that who we put in the White House and in the Senate is able to choose people who have the integrity to stand by what they say.
Yes.
Neil Gorsuch obviously doesn't have that integrity, otherwise he would have ruled differently. And it's very, very disheartening to see that kind of breach of trust and his judicial integrity, I will say that. In his personal life, I won't go in there, but as far as judicial integrity, we saw clearly a breach of that.
Yeah, and court watchers like us and people that this is what they do, they try to speculate as to why Gorsuch would do this, because Gorsuch did come in as a conservative. He did attend church at a liberal church that does allow same-sex marriages and same-sex ministers.
So maybe this was his own ideology. Maybe this was his own personal desires of what he wanted society to be based on his own liberal theology.
Yes.
And so he chose that over his oath to not breach the voice of the people in the legislative branch, to respect that, respect original intent of legislation, much less the Constitution. If he's willing to do this with the legislation like the Civil Rights Act and Roberts, what are they going to do down the road when it comes to the actual provisions in the Constitution?
Right.
The Equal Protection Clause.
Exactly.
So it is very concerning.
And it's important. The reason why it hasn't been changed for 45 years is because the branch of government that's most responsible to the people, most often have to go through an election, is Congress, is the House of Representatives. And there couldn't be agreement on that. Well, why couldn't there be agreement? Well, because you, ladies and gentlemen, you have the power there. Right. You can tell your congressperson, nope, we don't want this legislation. Or, for that matter, yes, we do want this legislation. Right. And so this tension in Congress, a lot of people, and we've talked about this a lot of times before, Brad, a lot of people like to talk, oh my gosh, there's gridlock in Congress. That's the way it was designed. It was designed so things would move slowly because the people's will has to prevail. That's what that is for. That's not how it's supposed to be in the court. The court is supposed to say, nope, that's what the law says, and so we got to stand for that.
Yeah.
And the incredible thing is, they're supposed to follow, and there's a great deal of discussion of this in this recent Supreme Court case, they're supposed to follow what was the intent for the word sex and in 1964. Well, we can definitely say, especially for those of us that were around in the 60s, that they did not mean orientation, and they did not mean identity, gender identity. They meant sex, man and a woman, so that women could be protected. Yeah. And interestingly, there's an organization of feminists who fought this case, did an amicus in favor of the funeral home, one of the plaintiffs here, one of the defendants, who fought this and said, no, we want to maintain the protection for women, which is at least an intellectually consistent argument.
Yeah, and I respect that.
I do too.
I totally respect that. And it's interesting that this feminist organization, which is not from the right, it's from the left.
Yes.
I mean, it's a liberal organization.
Yes.
And their cause, they fought for this language. They fought for the word sex to be on there. And yet they're against it. And I think some people may be wondering, well, if they're liberal, then why would they be against it? Why not just let it expand? Yeah. Do they see a potential threat to their rights as a group moving forward?
Yes, in fact, I think actually in that organization and in others like it, that are intellectually consistent, they see that when you start to water down the protections for women, that can't go well for women in the long run.
Right.
And there's all kinds of potential problems here. So for instance, and I know we're not going to dive too far into this today, but for instance, the notion that women should have their own locker rooms in schools, look, that's in danger now. That can be in danger because as this word interpreted sex to mean this broad definition, women can start to lose their own protections. It's as if women matter less than those that are supposed to be protected in terms of orientation, sexual orientation, and gender identity.
Yeah. And I think it's important for people to understand that.
Yeah.
Because what we're dealing with is a word, sex, that was put in there to protect women.
That's right.
But in reality, as we move forward, we see that term being used to be really an effective assault on women. Like, for example, who would have thought that that language used to protect women would now be used to justify forcing a 14-year-old girl or grown woman
Yes.
in a locker room
Yes.
and have to dress and be naked and shower in front of a 100% biological man who simply lays claim to feeling like he's a different gender because of a mental condition, gender identity dysphoria. And mind you, I'm saying that I by no means wish to demean people who have that mental condition.
No.
They need love, they need respect, they need understanding. From my perspective, they need counseling,
Yes.
to help them, or at least to be able to get counseling. So that's not the intent at all.
Yes.
But the problem, or for them to have a separate place to accommodate them as they have this mental condition. But the problem is, when we create a new right, oftentimes we trounce upon another right.
That's exactly right.
And what's being trounced now is the dignity of women.
Yes.
The greatest deprivation of rights for women today, in my opinion,
Yes.
is saying that they have to be forced, as a condition for employment with the United States of America, they have to be willing to be forced to be naked
Yeah.
daily in front of a man who is sexually turned on by looking at her. Many people think that, there's a lot of ignorance out there about gender identity dysphoria. Many people think that a man who has that, a biological man who has that, is turned on by looking at guys.
Yes.
The overall majority, one study says over 70% or over 85%, are actually turned on by looking at women.
Yeah.
I mean, when you think about what the degree and depth of demeaning as a condition for employment, women, just think about this. You're thinking about getting a job here in the United States, working for a government employer, say Border Patrol. You want to work for Border Patrol. And as a condition for employment, when you go to change, because you have to change there in the locker room, you can't leave with your uniform on going home. You may get rocks thrown through your windows and things like that, or have threats to your family. So in our society today, unfortunately, but that's what it is. So you have to change. You have to change there at your Border Patrol site. You have no choice. You're out there in the hot heat, in the desert, Arizona on the border. You're sweating. You need to shower before you go home, before you change back in your regular clothes. So you're showering every day as a condition for employment. A man can come into your locker room and look at you and wait for you to get out of the shower and look at you. And he could take off his clothes in front of you, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's a condition to be able to work in the United States of America for the United States government. That kind of a twisted application is what we see, because we've had like 17 states, or maybe not 17, more than 17 states, I guess, have already enacted state laws. The blue states, those occupied and run by Democrats and the legislatures of their states and the Democrat governors, they've passed legislation like this to demean women already. Yeah. And I don't want to politicize this, but I'm just saying it like it is. It is so clear cut, unfortunately. I wish we had some blue states that were more sensitive to women. Yeah. But we see that happening right now, moving forward. And now what this legislation does is this takes, in a very radical way, and forces every state in the country, private sector, as well as the public sector, the government sector, and the federal government, to be bound by this. And by the way, if you have any questions about any of this, don't hesitate to contact us. One thing that makes us unique as an organization, a legal organization, very unique, is that we don't, and I just love this, Michael, we don't just cherry pick a few high-profile cases and take those to the Supreme Court and tell everyone else to go away. We work hard to make sure that everyone gets help, that no one is left on the side of the road when it comes to these basic issues. Whether it's no church is too small, no family too insignificant, no business too minor or isolated. We want to make sure that everyone in the United States of America has their freedoms and liberties protected when it comes to the most basic fundamental rights imaginable: religious freedom, parental rights, the sanctity of human life, ability for us to live and be who we are and who our faith compels us to be in the land of the free and the home of the brave. You know, Michael, I'm encouraged. We have these challenges, we have these struggles. We've seen incredible victories. And folks, as this show carries on, you'll be given new information about our cases, the challenges that we're faced with, serious challenges.
Yes.
But also some great stories about victories that we can all rejoice in and be glad in as we move forward in the days ahead.
Given the choice of obeying God or the government, I believe Christians will obey God, even if there is hell to pay.
Scripture therapy offers solutions to challenges individuals face every day. Scripture therapy combines faith, psychology, and life experiences to reach those seeking more in their daily walk with God. The authors, Lester and Roxanne Trichet, have blended their skills to produce a powerful book that has the potential of helping people from all kinds of backgrounds and systems of belief. The Trichets are a dynamic duo, and their book is a must-read for anyone who wants to enhance their spirituality and improve their happiness quotient on day one. Available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iTunes, and www.scripturetherapycenter.com.
Justice Institute is absolutely doing great work.
This organization is a fighting organization. You help it, you're the same as the fighter.
I am so grateful to Pacific Justice Institute. Please support them. They are worth every penny.
It didn't cost us anything.
We would have drowned in legal fees. We would have been no more instantly.
I'm super grateful for PJI. They were a godsend.
Pacific Justice Institute as an organization is wholly committed, fully committed to doing the right thing, to being something good